if you really think about the demand for food and implications for resource use, many consumers already make that connection of what are the ecological implications of my food choices. You might have heard communities like San Francisco going meatless Monday, or Toyota looking at comparisons of their Prius versus a sheep, or you name it. There are lots and lots of communities, but also companies that make that link of food choices and ecological implications. Now, this slide here shows something which I found very interesting. It's from an advertisement from Sweden. It shows 3 burgers. On the top right, it shows a tofu burger with a 0.2 bubble associated to it. Then on the top, it shows a turkey burger, and on the left, a beef burger. Those little bubbles in blue indicate not the price, but the carbon footprint. So if you live in Sweden and you are concerned about your food choices, you might not just be concerned from a price standpoint, but also carbon footprint standpoint. You find these kind of developments all over Europe, and also starting to occur in the United States. So with that, I go to what Dr. Southgate just talked about. I will frame the issue of the overarching concern of having a growing human population and how that plays into food production. So we just heard that the average prediction is that by 2050 we have around 9.3 billion people. Currently we have almost 7 billion, so an increase of 2.3 billion over the next 40 years or so. So agencies like the United Nations FAO put out several reports, and these reports deal with exactly that issue of how do we grow the human food supply at a pace that the human population goes up. How do we do that? A few slides just showing how several of the animal commodities grow. On the x-axis here you see 1960 to 2010. On the y-axis, the growth of eggs, meat, milk, and then several other commodities during those years. We see that there is a growing demand in the developing world, in the third world, and that's mainly in Southeast Asia, of eggs and meat, but also milk. Oftentimes, these increases in consumption are driven by incomes. We see here something we saw in the previous presentation, too, that the more affluent countries have the highest per capita meat consumption, and the poorest countries have the lowest. So we see on the x-axis per capita GDP, on the y-axis per capita meat consumption. Meat production overall worldwide is growing. East and Southeast Asia we see here on the top, and then Latin America and the Caribbean, pretty steep increases. Milk production also, South Asia is increasing pretty dramatically. Latin America, Caribbean is increasing. Overall, we see increasing trends, particularly in the developing world, in the third world, or in those countries that are starting the development. Overall world production of main categories of meat, we see the top line in orange is poultry, followed by pork, and then the red line is cattle, and the yellow sheep and goat. We see increasing trends in the world production of meat from 61 until 2007. So the trends are pretty clear that in particularly the emerging countries of the world, we see pretty rapid increases in the consumption of animal protein. Here we see trends in land use area for livestock production and total production of meat and milk. And the steep increase there is related to meat production. So this slide came from the United Nations FAO, and it shows that when we look at land use and how land use is linked to different production practices, meat production and the increase in meat production has the largest impact on land use. And that is why the United Nations FAO and other international agencies and entities like World Bank and so on make that link of how does a growing demand for animal protein affect ecosystems and land use. A couple of slides here from this report that came out by the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and I want to share those with you. The first one here shows the globe, and in red the areas in the world with high livestock populations. And oftentimes we think of the Midwest or other places in the United States when we think of livestock. But if you look at South America, Uruguay, let's say, or Argentina or Brazil, or you look at India or China or Northern Europe, then you really see where we have the largest numbers of livestock in the world. India and China by far have the largest numbers of livestock. And the growth is predicted to increase very dramatically. Now, the next slide is a particularly important one. This one. It shows, again, a map from the United Nations FAO, and it shows the globe. And those areas in color are the only areas where we have arable land. Land to grow crops or animals. And this amount of arable land cannot significantly be increased. This is it. So whether we grow 8 or 9 or 10 billion people, regardless of that, we will not be able to increase the land mass that we can use to grow crops or animals. So if we have a constant resource of land, but an increase in demand for, in this case, animal protein, the question, of course, arises, how can we satisfy that growing demand? That is the key question. This slide here shows where in the world the use of animal protein or the production of animal protein leads to land use changes. The United Nations FAO says this is 1/3 of the carbon footprint of livestock systems, namely the change of land use from natural, let's say, forest land to anthropogenic use, let's say grazing land for cattle. And we see that in parts of South America and parts of Africa, Central Africa, Southeast Asia, we do see red, and red means that land is taken out of forest use and into pasture land. And that is what the FAO was particularly concerned about when they wrote their report titled Livestock's Long Shadow, and I will talk about that in a few minutes. If you look at the United States, you will see that there is no red in the United States. What that means is, instead of red, we see dark green, and dark green means that there's net afforestation, so increase in forest land in the United States. One reason why the FAO's 18% number of greenhouse gases associated with livestock doesn't apply to the United States is that we are actually not taking forest out of production and changing it into pasture, let's say, but we are doing the opposite. We are increasing forest land in this country. This is, however, how it looks in parts of Brazil, where natural forest is taken out and clear-cut, and then pastures are established for cattle. And that's one of the reasons why the carbon footprint of cattle systems in Brazil really brings the entire carbon portfolio of the cattle system in South America up. This is why, if you look at the implication of cattle production in South America, the South American numbers are so high because they're taking out forests that normally sequester carbon, that take on carbon, and they put in cattle and other livestock systems that net produce greenhouse gases. A couple of slides here with respect to efficiencies. This slide here shows emissions from dairy and beef herds in select countries, the Netherlands, India, and Brazil. If you look at the dairy and beef numbers, these are CO2 equivalents. These are basically the greenhouse gas numbers, values per kilogram of protein. So in the Netherlands, if you want to produce a kilogram of protein, you produce 46 kilograms of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases. In India, to produce the same amount of protein, you produce 160 kilograms of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases. And in Brazil, it's 128. On the beef side, beef animal in the Netherlands, 176 CO2 equivalent kilogram units per kilogram of protein. And then in India, it's 3 times more, and in Brazil, it's much more too. So what that really shows us is that per kilogram of animal protein, the developed countries are much more efficient, and that means we produce way more product per unit of environmental impact. And that is widely appreciated by most scientists in the world, but not by the people living in those countries. In countries like this one here, people think if we were to be more extensive, less intensive, then that would be better for the environment, right? Most everybody here in the population thinks the less efficient you are, the more extensive you are, the better it is for the environment. I can assure you from a scientific standpoint, the opposite is true. The more efficient we are, and the more intensive, the better it is for the environment. However, as our next speaker will tell us, sometimes the efficiencies that benefit the environment conflict with other societal needs, like animal welfare, food safety, and so on. But I'm just talking about the environment right now. This slide here shows the ruminant meat, the dairy, and the non-ruminant meat categories on the x-axis, on the y-axis, the total amount of greenhouse gas, CO2 equivalents per dollar of output. On the left side, the ruminant meat, if you look at the different colors, the US on the left side in blue, followed by the EU, followed by Brazil in green, China in purple, and then India in blue. Now, what that really shows you is that there are huge differences in how much greenhouse gases, in this case, you get in different parts of the world. If you compare the US with Brazil, oh my gosh, this is a huge difference. 4 versus 40 something. This is like a 10-time increase in greenhouse gas, Brazil versus the United States. Why? Because you take away forests, animals are less efficient, they have less health care, and so on. So the same is true for the dairy sector, but to a lesser extent. In general, we know, and this slide shows it, that productivity efficiencies are directly correlated to environmental impact. On the x-axis, it shows the amount of fat and protein-corrected milk. The more, and on the y-axis, it shows the amount of greenhouse gases as CO2 equivalents. What this slide really shows is the more you produce per cow per year, the smaller is your greenhouse gas footprint. And that is intuitive to most people in the room. This slide shows where interventions can take place and how they play into the environmental picture. On the left side, you see that improved fertility, improved health, and improved genetics lead to decreased number of animals that are needed per kilogram of product. Obviously, that's clear to most of you. Also, the more energy-dense feed you feed, the less greenhouse gases you get. So, basically, if you compare, for example, a grass-fed diet, fed to cattle, with a corn-fed diet, then we know, even if you do the total life cycle assessment of grass-fed versus corn-fed animals, that the corn-fed animals will produce way less methane overall in the whole picture. Why? Because the methanogens that produce methane in the rumen, they thrive off roughage. The more roughage in the diet, the more methane you get. And that is the number one contributor to greenhouse gases in a beef system or in a dairy system and so on. Now, if you ask John Sixpack out in the public what they think about that, they will tell you the opposite is true. The more grass and the more extensive, the better for the environment. That is not the case. At least not from a greenhouse gas perspective. Now, my lab has taken it on a couple of years to address some of the concerns that the United Nations FAO fielded. And that was namely this report here, Livestock's Long Shadow. Livestock's Long Shadow was pretty popular, and it's still pretty popular in the common press. It was published in 2006. It's a report by the FAO, United Nations FAO, and that report said that the livestock sector is a major player responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. And they said this, the livestock sector is has a larger share than transportation. So if you think about this statement, it says not just is livestock responsible for 18% of all greenhouse gases globally, but it also makes that comparison of livestock with transportation, saying that livestock produces more greenhouse gas than all trucks, trains, planes, ships in the world combined. This thing came out in 2006. We published a paper rebutting it in 2009. Until then, nothing had happened. And this statement was quoted over and over and over again in all the big media outlets. So I will not go into the nitty-gritty. I will just basically give you a rundown of some of the most important findings that we had and why we think and now know that this statement is incorrect and why the FAO has appreciated our criticism and accepted it They're no longer saying that. So our paper was published in 2009. This is the title, Clearing the Air Livestock's Contribution to Climate Change. My co-authors were two of my graduate students and I. Basically, this slide shows the global livestock sector, the FAO number of 18%. So they say livestock is indeed the number one or a leading source of greenhouse gases in the world. In the United States, the EPA and other agencies say it's not even close to 18, it's 3.4%. That's all livestock species combined. So that's beef and dairy and pork and everything. Poultry, the whole thing is 3.4%. So why those differences, 18% versus 3.4%? Well, first of all, if you express something in percent, then that's, of course, a relative number. In developed countries like the United States, where we have a massive transportation sector, massive energy sector, and so on, the livestock sector is relatively dwarfed, just because of the sheer size of the other sectors. Whereas in countries like Paraguay or Ethiopia or so, where you have a very small transportation sector and a small energy sector and so on, livestock all of a sudden pops out. I used to live in Paraguay for 9 months, and I can assure you, in that country where you have a small transportation sector, and where you have twice as many cattle as people, and where they're clear-cut on a large scale forests, all of a sudden that livestock sector will become very dominant. Up to 50% of the carbon portfolio is caused by livestock. In a country like Ethiopia, where you hardly have any cars, but a lot of cows and other livestock, the livestock sector might be as high as 90%, 90. So if you now look at the United States with 3.4% and those developing countries, and you take all these nations in the world, put them into one pot and generate an average, then that average might really look high, like 18%. That does not mean that you can take that 18% and apply it to the United States, or apply it to Paraguay, or apply it to Ethiopia. But that's exactly what the world media has done. And that is why livestock in this country has really scored very poorly in the media. Because everybody now says, if you really want to make a big difference to your carbon footprint, then stop eating meat. Meatless Mondays are the cure. That's what they tell our consumers in this country. I heard a TV show the other day where the moderator said, if you drive a Prius and you eat one burger a week, that's the same as driving a Hummer. And he quoted that. That's what he quoted. Now, that really leads us to a very, very bad path for solutions, because it suggests to the consumer that their transportation choices makes no difference. Their heating and cooling choices make no difference. Just eat one burger less a week and you'll be fine. No problem. Obviously, a very ill-advised statement. Now, why is it that we have such different numbers throughout the world? Well, efficiencies are key to that explanation. This slide here shows on the left side the greenhouse gas emissions. In green, we see methane. In blue, we see nitrous oxide, the second greenhouse gas, in developing countries, and on the right side, in developed countries. So, as you can see on the right side, the developed countries, like the US or European countries, have a very much reduced carbon footprint compared to developing countries. And that is because of the efficiencies that we know exist in our developed societies. We have such advanced healthcare and nutrition and genetics that we can produce a given amount of product with as few animals as possible. I'll give you one idea. If you look at the southern part of California, the southern tip of California, the average cow produces 20,000 pounds of milk. You go just over the border to Mexico, to a dairy there. The average cow there produces 4,000 pounds. So the happy cow in California, 20,000 pounds, and the one in Mexico, 4,000 pounds. It takes 5 Mexican cows, on average, to produce the same amount of milk as one cow in California. They produce the same amount of product, but these 5 produce way more methane. They produce way more waste. They produce way more ammonia and so on than that one cow on the other side. The key will be to have as few animals to produce a given amount of product. That is key. According to this United Nations FAO report, and I agree totally with that portion of the report, intensification provides large opportunities for mitigation. Intensification provides large opportunities for mitigation of greenhouse gases and other emissions. Now that is a statement that was often overread. Today the United Nations FAO says this is the key to their new message, that if you want to reduce environmental impact, you have to do it with as few animals as possible. Be efficient. That's what they are saying today. I want to give you a few numbers just so that you have some ballpark in your head. If you compare different sectors of society in the United States, transportation accounts for 26% of all greenhouse gases. Electricity production and use 31%, and the livestock sector 3.4%. So if people tell you that Prius and Hummer story, it's good to have some numbers in your head. The other issue here with livestock is, one of the issues I really didn't like about livestock's long shadow was, this was one global number across all species. So first of all, I have a big problem with lumping the world into one average. Obviously, we have huge differences across regions in the world. And secondly, I really didn't like that they lumped all species into livestock, because we know there are huge differences across livestock species. And so after we wrote our report, they agreed that they need to take apart livestock into dairy, beef, and so on, poultry, pigs, and to desegregate into different regions in the world. And they have done that. And I will show you a slide in a minute. So I want to give you a few take-home messages here. First of all, this 18% number, first of all, I think it's an ill-advised number, but it certainly is not a number that you can use for any one region in the world. It was intended originally to be a global average. A global average doesn't really help anybody. It doesn't help any region in the world. It's just that, a global number. This number is so high mainly because of land use issues incorporated into it, mainly deforestation. That's the reason why that number is so high, why it's higher in their report compared to any other report. The biggest flaw, in my opinion, the biggest flaw of the report is that when they compared livestock with transportation, they made a major mistake. And that major mistake was that they used different assessment methods to establish the carbon footprint. For livestock, they did what's called a total life cycle assessment, looking into everything that goes into livestock production, from fertilizer, herbicide, from soils to crops to animals to waste, the whole life cycle. They looked at the whole life cycle for livestock, but for transportation, they didn't do that. For transportation, they only looked into what does it take to burn gas. They didn't look into what does it take to build trucks, trains, planes, ships, roads, get the oil out of the ground in Saudi Arabia, ship it to Texas, refine it, get it to the gas pump, and then burn it. But only the burning of gas. So they did a total life cycle assessment for livestock, and they compared it only to direct emissions from transportation. That's why that was an apples to oranges comparison, which we critiqued, and which they since accepted as being real. So they use different assessment methods. Today they actually say that the livestock production in the United States and many other developed countries could be a model for the rest of the world, and because of efficiencies that we have seen here. The largest issue that the FAO, see in developing countries is digestibility, mainly nutrition, and in developed countries like the US, waste management, where they say we could do a better job in producing fuel or power or so from waste. So a follow-up report by the FAO included a graph, this graph here. On the x-axis it shows different areas in the world. On the y-axis the total amount of greenhouse gases. As you can see, North America on the left has the lowest carbon footprint per unit of fat-corrected milk, protein and fat-corrected milk. I want to point out that North America is not obviously the United States, but it is also Mexico. And again, we produce 5 times more milk per cow in the United States than they do in Mexico. So even this smaller column is not the picture representing the United States. Our column should really be about half of what you see there under North America. So I'm almost there. I have another 3 minutes. With respect to methane emission from livestock, we know that we can do a good job. When Jude Copper compared dairy production 1944 to 2007, she found that modern dairies require 20% less animals, 20% less feedstuff, 35% less water, 10% less less land to produce the same amount of milk as their peers in 1944. She also found that since 1944, today's dairies produce 43% less methane, 56% less nitrous oxide per billion kilograms of milk, again emphasizing the importance of efficiencies on the carbon footprint. The same is true for many other pollutants like ammonia and so on. The more efficient you get, the more you dilute out. However, that does not mean that we are good for a home run here, that we have no more problems. For example, reproductive efficiencies are of great concern. They are going down over the years. And that means our replacement herds, for example, on dairies, are going up. We need to have more and more replacement animals in order to maintain our herd size. And that means we have more and more animals that are not producing milk in the case of dairies, but they eat and excrete but don't produce milk. They are just there because our culling rates are high. So there are certain issues that certainly need to be addressed. Very recently, I was invited to Washington, D.C. to a National Academies of Science meeting where the author of Livestock's Long Shadow was invited, along with me, and we discussed his reports, his original Livestock's Long Shadow report, and follow-up reports. Today, we are really, really in agreement on many issues. Originally, we were, and today we are much closer than where we were. Today, the FAO really emphasizes the need for intensification as the best mean for environmental mitigation. They are writing a new report today that's called Shrinking the Shadow. That's what it's called, Shrinking the Shadow. And Shrinking the Shadow basically deals with how can we basically generate a second green revolution, exporting those production practices that we know are effective in countries like this one into countries that really need them because they have growing demands. Because it will not be good enough for China and India to import all their food. They want to produce it themselves, and they have to produce it themselves. But they are resource restricted. I met with the CEO of Kentucky Fried Chicken in China, the number one consumer of broilers in the country. Kentucky Fried Chicken gobbles up 80% of their broilers. That one company, 80% of their broilers. They have a huge increase in demand for broilers and other animal protein commodities over there.